My name is Captain Linda Morse, 33 years old. After surviving 2 deployments in Afghanistan, I never imagined I'd nearly die on the oak floorboards my own father laid by hand. The attacker wasn't a foreign enemy. It was my brother Damian, trying to kill me over the deed to our childhood home. Dad had been gone only 3 months when Damian showed up with his wife and those papers. I can still feel my ribs cracking under his weight, the warm slick of blood pooling under my head. But the sound that will haunt me forever wasn't the pain. It was my sister-in-law Serafina's voice, cool and clear from the doorway. "Finish it, Damian. Just put her down for good." Before I share what happened that day and how everything changed, let me know where you're listening from. And hit that like button if you know that when money gets involved, sometimes blood means nothing. The house on Washington Avenue was still thick with the scent of lilies from the funeral. 3 days had passed since we buried my father, but the sweet, cloying smell clung to the curtains and the furniture, a constant reminder of what and who was gone. I sat in the living room, my hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Outside, the Ohio autumn was in full display, letting go of its fiery leaves in a gentle swirling descent. It was a quiet kind of grief. The neighbors had come and gone in a steady, compassionate stream, their arms laden with Tupperware containers filled with the comforting casseroles of the Midwest. Tuna noodle, green bean, baked ziti. They'd murmur their sympathies, pat my shoulder, and leave another piece of their heart on our kitchen counter. I was grateful for their kindness, for the shared sense of community that defined our small town. But once they left, the silence that Dad's absence had carved into the house returned, heavier and more profound than before. It was a silence no amount of food or condolences could fill. I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Damian and his wife Serafina, descending from the guest room they'd claimed. Serafina was already on her phone, her voice sharp and cutting through the quiet solemnity of the house. "I don't care about the market fluctuations," she snapped into the receiver. "Just sell the stocks. Liquidate the entire position." She caught my eye as she reached the bottom step. There was no flicker of sympathy in her gaze, no shared sorrow for the man whose funeral she had just attended in a designer black dress that probably cost more than my father's couch. There was only impatience, a restless energy that seemed entirely out of place in a house of mourning. Damian, on the other hand, had arranged his face into a mask of brotherly concern. He sat in Dad's worn armchair across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Linda, I know this is a difficult time," he began, his voice a low, rehearsed murmur. "But we need to be practical. This house, it's a lot for you to handle on your own." Before I could answer, Serafina cut in, her voice devoid of any pretense. "What he means is, it's a dead asset, a pile of money just sitting here, tied up in wood and brick." I stared at her, then at my brother, the man I'd built forts with in this very living room. The words felt like stones thrown into a still pool. "This is my home," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse from days of unshed tears. Later that afternoon, our family lawyer, Alistair Finch, arrived. He was a kind, older man who had known my father for 40 years, and his presence brought a fleeting sense of stability. He sat us down at the dining room table and explained the will. It was simple, and I thought, incredibly fair. The house was left to me, as Dad knew it was the only home I'd ever truly had. However, the will stipulated that I was to pay Damian half of the house's appraised value within 5 years. It was my father's last attempt to be equitable, to take care of both his children. Damian did not see it that way. 5 years? He let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed unnervingly in the quiet room. The old man thought I could wait 5 years. Serafina crossed her arms, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her silk blouse. She looked at me, not as a sister-in-law, but as an obstacle, an insect to be brushed aside. "Our lawyer will be in touch, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone icy. There was clearly some undue influence at play here. Mr. Finch looked shocked, but he maintained his professional composure, packed his briefcase, and left us to the suffocating atmosphere they had created. The moment the front door closed, the facade of brotherly concern evaporated from Damian's face, replaced by a raw, undisguised contempt. He loomed over me, his shadow falling across the table. "What did you do, Linda?" he snarled. "Did you brainwash him in his final days? Fill his head with your pathetic war stories while I was in Chicago working for a living?" I was speechless. The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth, that my mind couldn't form a response. "What are you talking about?" I finally stammered. "Don't play innocent," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You've always been his perfect daughter in your damn uniform, the righteous Captain Morse. But you're just a grunt, living off taxpayer money. I'm the one who makes real money, who built something of himself." He turned and stormed back up the stairs, Serafina trailing behind him like a loyal viper. I was left alone in the silence, the smell of lilies suddenly feeling like a funeral shroud. The words he'd thrown at me hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. In that moment, I realized a terrible truth. My war wasn't over when I came home from Afghanistan. It had just begun, right here, in the place I was supposed to be safe. Numbly, I walked into my father's study, a small room off the kitchen that smelled of sawdust and old books. I needed to feel close to him to find some piece of the honorable man I remembered. My fingers traced the spines of his history books until they landed on a worn, leather-bound ledger on his desk. It was his old expense book. I opened it, the pages crinkling under my touch. His handwriting was as neat and precise as he had been. I saw the usual entries: groceries, property tax, electric bill. But then another set of entries started to appear, over and over, spanning years. For Damian, rent money. For Damian, car repairs. For Damian, investment. The sums were staggering. My father, a retired veteran on a fixed pension, had been bleeding himself dry for years to fund his son's life in the city. The injustice of it settled in my chest, a cold, heavy weight. This wasn't a recent development. This wasn't about grief or a poorly understood will. This was a sickness that had been festering for a long, long time. I closed the book, the question forming in my mind, a quiet dread that would soon become a battle cry. When did this all begin? The answer to my question, when did this all begin, was waiting for me in my father's workshop. The air in there still held the scent of him, a comforting mix of pine shavings, machine oil, and the faint aroma of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke on the porch. I sat on his workbench, the same one where he'd taught me how to properly hold a hammer, and continued to turn the brittle pages of his old ledger. The neatly written columns were a map of my father's life and a map of my brother's slow, steady corruption. Beside the predictable, everyday expenses, the entries for Damian stood out like wounds on the page. They started small, a decade ago. Damian, textbooks. Damian, security deposit for apartment. But they grew in frequency and amount over the years. Damian, rent money. Damian, car repairs. And the most frequent, most heartbreaking one, Damian, investment. The word always written in quotation marks, as if my father knew it was a lie but wrote it down anyway. A quiet acknowledgement of his own son's deception. I did a rough calculation in my head. Tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. My father, a proud Army veteran who lived modestly on his pension and the income from his small woodworking business, had been silently siphoning his life savings to fund his son's glamorous, fragile existence in Chicago. The pain of this revelation was sharper somehow than the initial shock of the will. This wasn't a sudden act of greed from my brother. This was a long, sustained campaign of taking. My father hadn't just given Damian money. He had given away pieces of his own security, his own peace of mind, one check at a time. I closed the book and the memories started to unspool. Fragmented scenes from our lives playing out in the quiet workshop. I remembered one summer afternoon, years ago, when I was home on leave from basic training. Dad was mending a section of the picket fence out front. I came out to help him, and he showed me how to align the posts just right. "A family's like this fence, sweetheart," he'd said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You always have to check for loose posts and fix them before the whole thing comes down." I realize now, with a hollow ache in my chest, that he had spent years trying to fix his loose post, The divergence, the moment our paths split, was crystal clear in my mind. The day my acceptance letter to West Point arrived, Dad had wrapped me in a bear hug, his eyes shining with a pride that filled me with more warmth than any medal ever could. Damian, home for the summer before his senior year of college, where he was studying finance, had just smirked from the doorway. "So you're going to be a government bullet stopper?" he'd scoffed. "I'm going to make millions." From that day forward, we were on two different trajectories, guided by two different compasses. I was learning about the 3 C's of leadership: competence, commitment, and character. I was learning about honor, about a code that meant you never left a fallen comrade behind. He was learning about financial leverage, risk management, and the art of the deal. I wore my uniform with a pride that came from a deep sense of purpose. He, on the other hand, seemed to wear a constant, low-grade shame about where he came from. He hated our small blue-collar town, hated its simplicity. He scrubbed the Ohio accent from his speech and always referred to our home as being near a more respectable city, as if the name of our town itself was a stain on his reputation. He even sold Dad's vintage Omega watch, a gift from Grandpa, to pay off a gambling debt he'd racked up on a business trip to Vegas, claiming it had been stolen. Dad knew. He always knew. But he never called him out on it. He just kept trying to fix the fence. Then came Serafina. The first time Damian brought her home, I watched her survey our comfortable, well-loved house as if she were inspecting a condemned building. Her eyes scanned Dad's collection of antique tools on the wall with disdain. She turned her nose up at the set of Corelle dinnerware Mom had cherished. During dinner, right in front of my father and me, she'd placed a hand on Damian's arm and sighed dramatically. "Darling," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension, "when are we finally going to escape this hole?" My father didn't say a word. He just quietly finished his meatloaf. But I saw the light in his eyes dim just a little. I saw the slight slump in his shoulders. He knew in that moment that his son had chosen a partner who amplified his worst qualities. His ambition curdled into greed, his shame into outright contempt. She wasn't just a bad influence, she was gasoline thrown on a smoldering fire. The workshop phone, an old rotary model Dad kept on the wall, suddenly rang, startling me out of my reverie. I picked it up. It was Mark, an old friend from high school who now worked as a financial analyst in Chicago, someone who had occasionally crossed paths with Damian. "Linda, I'm so sorry about your dad," he began, his voice hesitant. "And listen, I'm sorry to be calling with this, but I think you need to know." "Know what, Mark?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Damian's in trouble, real trouble," he said, his voice low. "He got caught up in some crypto scheme, leveraged himself to the hilt, and lost everything. I'm not just talking about his money, Linda. He lost his clients' money, a lot of it. He's not just broke, he's desperate." As Mark's words sank in, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The frantic rush to settle the estate, the contempt, the cruelty, the complete lack of grief. My brother wasn't just being greedy. He was a cornered animal. He needed the money from our father's house not for a better life, but to save the fraudulent one he had built. My father's house, the fortress of my childhood, the only sanctuary I had left in the world, wasn't just an asset to him. It was his final sacrifice, and I was the one standing in his way. I once attended a briefing at Bagram Airfield about psychological operations, or PSYOPs. The instructor outlined the enemy's textbook strategy: isolate the target, demoralize them through relentless pressure, spread disinformation to turn their allies against them, and attack their most vulnerable points. I never imagined that my own brother would deploy those same tactics against me, not in a dusty war zone, but in our quiet corner of Ohio. The campaign began with the phone calls. The first one came at 3:14 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me from a shallow, restless sleep. It was Damian. His voice was a pathetic, theatrical whisper, laced with fake desperation. He spun a sob story about loan sharks and fabricated debts, begging me to just sign the house over to him so he could leverage it. I listened without saying a word, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. When he finished his monologue, I simply hung up. The next day, it was Serafina's turn. She called during my lunch break, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, false concern. "Linda, darling," she cooed. "I'm just so worried about you. The burden of a big house like that, all alone, it's going to keep you from ever finding a husband and having a real family." The manipulation was so blatant, it was almost insulting. But the text messages were the worst. They were short, sharp, and designed to wound. A message from Damian would flash on my screen at a random hour. "Dad would be so disappointed in you." I didn't reply. I didn't block their numbers. I did what I was trained to do when engaging an enemy. I observed and I documented. I took a screenshot of every message. I logged every call in a new notebook. Date, time, caller, and a summary of the content. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was an intelligence officer gathering data on enemy activity. The next phase of the operation was the disinformation campaign. My Aunt Carol called me one Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight with a nervous concern that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Linda, honey," she began. "Serafina called me. She said that you pressured your father to change the will when he wasn't of sound mind." My blood ran cold, then hot. "Aunt Carol, that is an absolute lie." "Well, that's not all," she continued, her voice wavering. "She said you forbade Damian from visiting in those final weeks, that you were trying to keep your father all to yourself." They weren't just attacking my integrity anymore. They were desecrating the memory of my final moments with my father. They were painting me as a monster, a greedy, manipulative vulture who had preyed on a dying man. I calmly and methodically explained the truth, but I could hear the seed of doubt in my aunt's voice. The poison was working. They had successfully created a family group chat on Facebook, one I was conspicuously not invited to, and were posting old photos of Dad with captions like, "Missing this great man. It's a shame he was so lonely and easily influenced at the end." They were isolating me, turning my own family into a jury that was hearing only one side of a twisted story. Then came the physical incursions. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon to find the back door unlocked. I drew the 9mm I now kept in my purse, clearing the house room by room, just as I'd been trained. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, but the message was clear. "We can get to you whenever we want. You are not safe here." The violation of it, the deliberate shattering of my sense of security, left me shaking with a quiet, controlled rage. A few days later, the war escalated. I was scrolling through real estate listings online just to keep an eye on the market when I saw it. My own home. It was listed for sale on Zillow. There were pictures of my living room, my kitchen, the pattern on my bedspread. The listing agent was from a high-end firm in Chicago. Damian had let a realtor into my house behind my back, had him photograph my private spaces, and had put my life up for sale without my consent. This was no longer a dispute. This was a declaration of war. He wasn't just trying to take my house, he was trying to erase my existence from it. The final tactic was direct intimidation. His black BMW started appearing on our street late at night. He wouldn't stop, just cruise by slowly, his headlights sweeping across my living room window like a searchlight from a prison tower. It was a classic intimidation tactic, a predator circling its prey. He wanted me to feel watched, to know that even inside my fortress, I was exposed. One night, after his car passed for the third time, I gave up on sleep. I sat in the dark of the living room, my father's old Colt 45 resting on the coffee table in front of me. The moonlight glinted off the polished steel. I wasn't afraid of him. I was disgusted. Disgusted that the boy I once built snowmen with had become this creature. Disgusted with myself for not seeing the monster he was becoming sooner. It was in that moment, sitting in the dark, that I knew I couldn't fight this alone anymore. The perimeter had been breached. The enemy was inside the wire. I needed backup. If you've ever had to fight a battle you never asked for, a battle that someone in your own family started, hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, just type the word honor if you believe that's something worth fighting for. I picked up my phone, my fingers scrolling past Damian's and Seraphina's names until I found the one I was looking for. The one person I knew who understood my father's code, because he lived by it himself. I pressed the call button. It rang twice before he picked up. "Eli," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's Linda. I need your help." The silence after I hung up the phone was heavy, filled with the echo of my own desperate request. For a moment, I wondered if I had been right to call, to pull someone else into the toxic mess my family had become. But the sound of an engine rumbling down the street, the familiar growl of an old Ford pickup, erased all doubt. 10 minutes. It had taken him 10 minutes. Eli's truck pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He got out, a silhouette of steadfast reliability against the night. He wasn't just a neighbor. Eli Vance had been my father's best friend since they were boys. He was a retired police chief, a man whose moral compass pointed true north no matter what storm was raging. He wasn't empty-handed. In one hand, he carried a heavy-duty toolbox. In the other, a large thermos that I knew was filled with the strong black coffee he and my dad used to drink at all hours. "All right, Captain," he said as I opened the door, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Let's secure your perimeter." For the next few hours, we worked. The exhaustion and fear that had been my constant companions faded into the background, replaced by a focused sense of purpose. Eli moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his life bringing order to chaos. He checked every window, tightening the latches, adding new sash locks to the older frames. He replaced the flimsy lock on the back door with a heavy-duty deadbolt that clicked into place with a satisfying, definitive thud. As he worked, he talked me through it, pointing out the vulnerabilities of the house. "Your dad was a good soldier, Linda," he said, his voice laced with a deep sadness as he inspected the overgrown bushes near the living room window. "But he built this house for a family. He wasn't thinking about blind spots or fields of fire. He wasn't expecting the enemy to come from the inside." That single sentence perfectly captured the heartbreak of it all. This fortress, built with love, was never designed to withstand a siege from within its own ranks. Our final task was installing the security cameras, a simple, modern system he'd picked up at a hardware store on his way over. We mounted one over the front door, another covering the back porch, and a third aimed down the driveway. As we connected the final wire and the live feed flickered onto my laptop screen, showing the quiet, empty street under the glow of the streetlights, a profound sense of relief washed over me. It was the first time in weeks I hadn't felt completely exposed. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east when Eli finally declared the job done. He went out to his truck and returned with a foil-covered casserole dish. "Martha sent this," he said, placing it on the kitchen table. "She's worried sick about you. Said a soldier can't fight on an empty stomach." He peeled back the foil, revealing a perfectly brown shepherd's pie, steam rising from it in a fragrant cloud. It was the ultimate comfort food, a dish his wife had made for our family countless times over the years, especially after my mom passed. The smell of it, the simple kindness of it, broke through the disciplined armor I'd been wearing for weeks. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my father had helped me with my homework, and ate in a comfortable silence. The warmth of the food spread through me, and suddenly, I was crying. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, hot tears that streamed down my face. I was crying for my father, for my broken family, for the sheer exhaustion of it all. But mostly, I was crying out of gratitude for the man sitting across from me, who represented a decency and loyalty I thought had vanished from my world. Eli didn't say anything, he just let me cry. And when the tears subsided, he started to talk. He told me stories about my dad I'd never heard before. He told me about the time they went on a disastrous fishing trip and lost their canoe, about how my dad had spent a whole weekend helping him re-shingle his roof after a bad thunderstorm, refusing to take a dime for it. "This house, Linda," he said, gesturing around the kitchen. "It's not just a building, it's a part of this town's memory. Your dad's memory is in every board he cut, every nail he hammered. He was a good man. The best I ever knew." His words were a balm on a raw wound, reminding me of what I was fighting for. Not just a piece of property, but a legacy of honor. As the sun rose properly, casting golden light into the kitchen, Eli stood up to leave. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Linda," he said, his gaze serious and unwavering. "I made a promise to Arthur a long time ago. I told him I'd always look out for his kids." He sighed, a flicker of pain in his eyes. "I feel like I failed with Damian. I watched him drift, and I didn't do enough. But I won't fail you. I won't let him hurt you." He looked toward the laptop where the camera feed showed the world outside waking up. "Let 'em run, Linda. Just let them record everything. The truth is your best weapon." Then he looked back at me. "Anytime you feel unsafe, anytime you see that black BMW, you call me. Don't hesitate. You call me, and I'll be here. I'm your quick reaction force now." That promise, made by an old cop in my father's kitchen, felt more real, more binding than any tie of blood that had been so viciously severed. The battle wasn't over. But now, I had an ally. And for the first time in a long time, I had hope. A week of relative silence passed after Eli helped me fortify the house. The late-night drive-bys stopped. The harassing phone calls ceased. A small, foolish part of me began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had realized they were pushing too hard and had backed off. It was a fragile hope, the kind you're almost afraid to acknowledge for fear of jinxing it. Then, on a Friday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Damian. His voice was completely different from the last time we'd spoken. The snarling contempt was gone, replaced by a tone that sounded eerily like the brother I used to know. Subdued, hesitant, almost remorseful. "Linda," he said quietly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. This has all gone way too far." I held my breath, my heart giving a painful lurch. Can we meet, talk this out, just the two of us, at Rosie's Diner, like we used to?" Rosie's Diner. The name alone was a strategic strike against my defenses. It was the backdrop to 100 happy childhood memories, the place Dad would take us for chocolate milkshakes after a Little League win or pancakes on a Saturday morning. The thought of meeting there, of talking like old times, was a powerful lure. Against every rational instinct, against the cold, hard data I'd been collecting for weeks, that tiny, treacherous flicker of hope inside me flared. What if he was telling the truth? What if my brother was still in there somewhere? "Okay, Damian," I said, my voice tight. "I'll be there at 6. The moment I walked into Rosie's, I knew I had made a catastrophic mistake. The familiar smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee filled the air, but the scene in the corner booth was all wrong. Damian was there, yes, but he wasn't alone. Serafina sat beside him, a plastic smile plastered on her face, her eyes gleaming with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was an ambush. My training screamed at me to turn around and walk out, but I was frozen, caught in the crossfire of curious glances from people I'd known my whole life. Mr. Henderson, my old history teacher, was in the next booth. Rosie herself was watching from behind the counter, a concerned frown on her face. To leave now would be to create even more of a scene. Trapped, I slowly walked over and slid into the vinyl seat opposite them. Before I could even speak, Serafina launched her performance. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the table, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, a perfect imitation of deep, heartfelt concern. "Linda, honey, I'm so glad you came," she began, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Damian and I have been so worried. We know you're going through so much. The intense stress of your military career, and then the terrible shock of losing your father." She let her voice trail off, shaking her head sadly. Sometimes trauma can make a person, well, it can make them act selfishly without even realizing it. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, my cheeks flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. This wasn't a conversation, it was a public tribunal, and I was the one on trial. Every eye in the diner felt like it was on our table. I kept my voice low and even. "Serafina, I have no idea what you're talking about." Damian jumped in, taking his cue perfectly. He raised his voice just a little, ensuring Mr. Henderson could hear every word. "Linda, Just stop being so stubborn. It's okay to admit you need help. You know Dad wasn't in his right mind at the end. You took advantage of him. The accusation, so bald-faced and cruel, hung in the air between us. I felt a wave of dizziness. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in front of everyone. Serafina leaned in to deliver the final, killing blow. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold pity. Her voice was like the cut of a razor blade. We just want what's rightfully ours, Linda. You can't just hoard that house forever, wallowing in the past. You need the money for proper treatment. She paused for dramatic effect. PTSD is a very real thing. We've been reading about it. And it's clearly turning you into someone you're not. Someone angry. Someone irrational. That was it. The last straw. In all my time in the service, I had never felt a rage like this. They had taken the thing I was most proud of, my uniform, my service, my sacrifice. And they were twisting it into a weapon to use against me, to paint me as unstable, as broken. It was the lowest, most despicable blow imaginable. My code of conduct as a soldier flashed through my mind. I will never surrender of my own free will. I would not surrender to this. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed myself up. My movements were calm, controlled. I looked down at them, at their two expectant, predatory faces. The noise of the diner seemed to fade away into a dull roar. You two are despicable, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and cold as ice, cutting through the low murmur of the restaurant. I turned my eyes to Damian, to the stranger wearing my brother's face. You are no longer my brother, I said. The words felt like stones, but they were the truth. Then I turned my back on them. I walked out of that diner, head held high, not looking back. I could feel their stares and the stares of everyone else, burning into my shoulder blades. I didn't stumble. I didn't run. I just walked. I didn't cry. The fury inside me had incinerated every last tear. By the time I reached the cool air of the parking lot, by the time I got into my truck and shut the door, I knew that any hope for peace, any lingering memory of the family we once were, was dead and buried. Back at the house, I walked straight to the mantelpiece and stood before the framed photograph of my father, taken the day he retired from the army, standing tall and proud in his dress uniform. I looked into his kind, honorable eyes, and the dam of my control finally broke. A single, hot tear traced a path down my cheek. I'm sorry, Dad, I whispered to the man in the photograph. I tried to do this your way. I tried to be quiet. I tried to be dignified. I wiped the tear away with the back of my hand. I can't be silent anymore. The 2 days after the diner ambush were quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of unnatural calm that comes before a hurricane, a silence pregnant with violence. I spent those 48 hours in a state of heightened alert, my senses sharp, my body humming with a low-grade adrenaline. I cleaned my weapons. I reviewed the camera footage. I slept in short, fitful bursts, always with one ear open. I knew they were coming. My vow in front of my father's photograph had changed the equation. The time for absorbing their attacks was over. Now, I would meet force with force. They came on Saturday morning. The sun was bright, the sky a crisp autumn blue. Birds were chirping. The world outside was deceptively peaceful. But when Damian's black BMW pulled into my driveway, my heart didn't leap with fear. It settled into a cold, hard rhythm. This was it. My phone was already in my hand. I sent a single, prearranged word to Eli. Here. I watched them on the security camera feed as they walked up to the front porch. Damian's face was a mask of grim determination. Serafina looked bored. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath, holstered my pistol at the small of my back, hidden by my jacket, and went to the door. I didn't open it all the way. I stood in the threshold, my body blocking the entrance, a human barrier. I made myself clear, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. You are not welcome here. For a split second, Damian looked taken aback by my cold defiance. Then the rage returned. With a guttural roar, he slammed his shoulder into the door, forcing it open and sending me stumbling backward into the entryway. He and Serafina stormed in, bringing the stench of their malice into my home. "We're ending this today," Damian snarled. He was waving a sheaf of papers in his hand, some kind of legal document his shark of a lawyer had probably drafted. "You're going to sign the papers to take out a mortgage on this house, and you're going to give us the money. Or I swear to God, I will burn this place to the ground with you in it." I looked at his contorted face, at the desperation churning in his eyes. The last shred of the brother I knew was gone, consumed by the monster he had become. "Never," I said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. All the years of his perceived slights, his failures, his jealousy, and his bottomless entitlement erupted in a single, violent explosion. He lunged. My training kicked in. I sidestepped, raising my arms to defend myself, but I had underestimated the raw, feral power of his rage. And a part of my brain, a small, stupid, sentimental part, was still screaming, "This is your brother." That hesitation was all he needed. He tackled me around the waist, his momentum carrying us both crashing down onto the hard oak floorboards of the living room. My head hit the floor. Stars exploded behind my eyes. Before I could recover, he was on top of me, his knees pinning my shoulders, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. A fist, the same one that used to throw a baseball with me in the yard, slammed into my jaw. The world tilted, a wave of nausea washing over me. He hit me again, and again. I could hear a sickening crack, feel a sharp, incandescent spear of pain shoot through my side. A rib. He'd broken a rib. I fought back, my hands clawing at his face, my nails digging for purchase. But he was a man possessed, fueled by a madness that gave him terrifying strength. My vision started to tunnel. The edges went dark. I could taste blood, warm and coppery, in the back of my throat. Through the hazy fog of pain, I saw him scramble off me. For a wild second, I thought it was over. But he was just getting a weapon. He grabbed the heavy bronze statuette from the fireplace mantel. It was a replica of the tomb of the unknown soldier from Arlington. A piece my father had cherished, a symbol of ultimate sacrifice and honor. Damian held it in both hands, raising it high above his head, his chest heaving. He was going to kill me. He was going to bash my skull in with a monument to our father's most sacred ideals. My fading vision darted to the doorway. Serafina stood there, arms crossed, watching. Her expression was not one of horror or shock. It was one of complete, placid detachment, as if she were observing a mildly interesting scene in a movie. She was waiting, and then she spoke. Her voice, crisp and clear, cut through the red haze of my pain. The words would be seared into my brain for all eternity. "Finish it, Damian," she said, her tone utterly casual. "Just put her down for good." It was a death sentence. The bronze statuette began its downward arc. In that split second, I didn't feel fear. My mind went quiet. My soldier's oath echoed in the silence. I will always place the mission first. My mission was to survive. Just as the metal began to descend, the back door burst open with a deafening crash. Eli. He moved with a speed that defied his age. His retired service revolver held steady in a two-handed grip, aimed squarely at Damian's chest. "Drop it! Police!" he bellowed, his voice a commanding roar that filled the room and shook the very foundations of the house. Damian froze, the statuette held aloft. The murderous rage in his eyes flickered and died, instantly replaced by a wide-eyed animal panic. Serafina's face, once so calm and composed, turned the color of ash. But Eli hadn't come alone. His other hand held his cell phone, its camera lens a small dark eye, recording every single second of the brutal reality. If you believe that no one should ever have to face a monster alone, hit that like button right now. And please show your support for Linda by commenting with a simple blue heart to represent the thin blue line that showed up to save her. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, closer, a chorus of approaching salvation. They were here. Help was here. The physical battle was over. The statuette clattered to the floor from Damian's nerveless fingers. I lay there, on the floorboards my father had laid, and I knew the war for justice, and for my very soul, had only just begun. But as I closed my eyes, the last thing I thought was, the video. Did he get the video? I woke up adrift in a fog of pain, tethered to consciousness only by the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room hummed above me, antiseptic and unforgiving. Every breath was a fresh agony, a sharp reminder of my 3 fractured ribs. A doctor, in a calm, detached voice, would later list my injuries: a severe concussion, deep tissue bruising across my face and torso, and a hairline fracture in my left cheekbone. But the physical pain was a distant signal compared to the vast, hollowed-out emptiness that had taken root in my chest. The place where a brother used to be. Eli was sitting in the vinyl visitor's chair beside my bed, his face a roadmap of worry. He looked like he hadn't slept. When he saw my eyes open, a wave of relief washed over his features. "Hey, Captain," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Welcome back." My first thought, the one that cut through the morphine haze, was a single, urgent question. "The video," I rasped, my throat raw. "Eli, did you get it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, holding it up like a holy relic. "They're in custody, Linda, both of them," he said, his voice firming with conviction. "And I've got everything, right here, the whole damn thing." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Our lawyer, Mr. Finch, he's on his way. You just focus on healing. This fight, we're going to win it." Looking at the unwavering loyalty in my father's best friend's eyes, I knew I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for him, for my father's memory, and for the very idea of justice. When Alistair Finch arrived an hour later, I'd already made a decision. The victim part of this story was over. Now, the strategist was taking command. I asked the nurse for a legal pad and a pen. Propped up against the pillows, with a throbbing headache that felt like a blacksmith's hammer inside my skull, I began to write. I constructed a timeline. It was as precise and detailed as any after-action report I'd ever filed. I started with the day of Dad's funeral and moved forward, documenting everything. Every 3 a.m. phone call, every manipulative text message, every lie spread to our relatives, the Zillow listing, the late-night drive-bys. I noted the date, the time, and the content of each hostile action. I was no longer a daughter processing trauma. I was an officer building a case, laying out the enemy's pattern of escalating aggression. When I handed the 9 handwritten pages to Mr. Finch, he read them in silence, his expression growing more grim with each page. When he finished, he looked up at me, a new level of respect in his eyes. "Captain Morse," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your discipline, even now, is astonishing. This is exactly what we need. This isn't just a he said, she said. This is a meticulously documented campaign of harassment and intimidation. They will not be able to claim this was a spontaneous act of passion. You've proven their intent." While I was recovering, Eli was doing what he did best. Good, old-fashioned police work. He called in a favor with a retired detective he knew on the Chicago PD, who then put him in touch with my friend Mark. Following the proper legal channels, they subpoenaed Damian's financial records. The truth, when it came, was even uglier than I had imagined. The documents were a testament to a life lived on the edge of a cliff. A mountain of credit card statements, defaulted loans, and devastating losses from a series of reckless crypto and stock market gambles. He hadn't just lost his own money. He had blown through his clients' portfolios. He and Serafina were beyond broke. They were facing total financial and social ruin, and likely criminal charges for fraud. When Mr. Finch presented the file to me in my hospital room a few days later, the motive was laid bare. "This is the story we will tell the jury," he explained, his tone clinical. "This was not a family dispute over an inheritance. This was a calculated and desperate conspiracy, fueled by greed. They didn't come to your house to negotiate, Linda. They came to rob you, and they were prepared to do whatever it took." A uniformed officer came by and added one last, damning piece to the puzzle. When they had arrested Damian and searched his car, they had found a large suitcase packed with his clothes, passport, and a significant amount of cash in the trunk. He had been planning to run the moment he had the money. Finally, it was time. The three of us, me, Eli, and Mr. Finch, gathered in a small, sterile conference room. Eli placed his phone on the table, connected it to a small speaker, and pressed play. The video was brutal. The grainy footage showed the door being forced, Damian's enraged face, the raw violence of the assault. I heard my own pained grunts, the sickening thud of his fists. I watched my own desperate struggle. It was horrifying to see, a violation all over again. And then, the audio picked it up. Serafina's voice, piped through the phone's small speaker, was chillingly clear, devoid of any panic or emotion. "Finish it, Damian. Just put her down for good." Mr. Finch reached out and hit pause. The image of Damian, statuette raised, froze on the screen. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the hospital's ventilation system. He turned to me, his lawyerly composure gone, replaced by a look of profound gravity. "Captain Morse," he said, his voice low but ringing with legal certainty. "This is no longer just evidence of a felonious assault." He met my eyes. "This is irrefutable evidence of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder." In that moment, for the first time, I truly understood the full magnitude of what I had faced. I had survived an execution attempt orchestrated by my own family, and now I held the weapon that would bring them to justice. The battle had just been defined, and I was ready to fight it. The morning of the trial, I didn't choose a suit. I chose my armor. My Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket crisp and perfectly pressed, the ribbons on my chest representing years of dedication, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. Walking into the county courthouse felt like stepping onto a different kind of battlefield. This wasn't about winning or losing ground. It was about a fight for the truth itself. My decision was deliberate. I wanted every person in that room, the judge, the jury, the spectators, and most of all, them, to see exactly who they had targeted. They hadn't just attacked a woman in her home. They had conspired to murder a captain in the United States Army. They had attacked the uniform and everything it stood for. They were already at the defendant's table when I walked in with Eli and Mr. Finch. Damian looked like a ghost. He was pale, gaunt, the arrogant swagger he always carried replaced by a hunted look in his eyes. Serafina, stripped of her designer labels and clad in a drab, ill-fitting beige pantsuit, looked small and pathetic. She kept trying to catch my eye, her expression a desperate, calculated performance of remorse. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. In my mind, they had already ceased to exist as my family. Today, they were simply the accused. When it was my turn to take the witness stand, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. As the prosecutor began his questions, I remembered my oath of enlistment, the promise to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I realized then that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the domestic ones, the ones who share your blood. Defending the truth today was its own form of defending my country's ideals. I did not tell my story as a victim. I did not cry. I presented the facts with the same methodical clarity I would use in a mission briefing. I walked the jury through the timeline I had created in my hospital bed. The prosecutor displayed the screenshots of the threatening text messages on a large screen for the court to see. The audio logs of the harassing phone calls were played, Serafina's saccharine voice filling the room, followed by Damian's desperate pleading. I detailed their psychological warfare campaign, step by step, my voice never wavering. On cross-examination, Damian's lawyer tried to use my service against me. "Captain Morse," he began, his tone slick with fake sympathy, "is it not true that soldiers returning from combat zones often suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? That it can lead to heightened aggression, paranoia, even memory loss?" He was trying to paint me as an unstable, violent veteran, the aggressor in my own home. I didn't look at him. I turned my body slightly and looked directly at the 12 men and women in the jury box. My service in the United States Army taught me how to face danger with courage and discipline, I said, my voice steady and clear. It did not teach me how to create it. I have seen the ugliness of war, sir. And the only scar I brought home from this war wasn't from Afghanistan. I paused, then placed a hand flat over my heart. It's right here. You could have heard a pin drop. But the real turning point, the moment the entire case solidified into a cold, hard certainty, was when the prosecutor played Eli's video. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly, and the large screen flickered to life. The shaky, terrifying footage filled the room. The jury saw Damian's face, contorted with rage. They saw him tackle me. They heard the sickening thud of his fists, my own ragged gasps for air. I saw one of the jurors, a grandmotherly woman with kind eyes, bring a hand to her mouth, her other hand clutching her pearls. Another juror, a burly man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, shook his head slowly, his jaw tight with disgust. The prosecutor let the video play, the raw brutality of it silencing every corner of the room. Then came the climax. The image of Damian raising the bronze statuette, and Serafina's voice emerging from the speakers with a horrifying, digital clarity. Finish it, Damian. Just put her down for good. The prosecutor hit pause, freezing the frame on Serafina's face at that exact moment. It was not the face of a panicked wife caught in a situation beyond her control. It was the face of a calm, detached observer, a predator. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble. The defense would have you believe this was a family argument that got out of hand, that Mrs. Morse was in a state of panic. He pointed a finger at the frozen image on the screen. I ask you to look at that face. Does that look like the face of a woman in a panic? The silence that followed was her true conviction. In the gallery, I saw Serafina's mother, a woman who had always treated me with kindness, bow her head and begin to sob quietly into her hands. The performance was over, the lies were dead. The raw, ugly truth had been laid bare for all to see. The jury took less than an hour. When they filed back in, their faces were grim, their duty heavy but their resolve absolute. I watched the foreperson, the woman with the pearls, as she handed the verdict slip to the bailiff. She refused to look at the defendant's table. Guilty. The word echoed in the silent courtroom. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, conspiracy, solicitation. Damian slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut. Serafina just stared blankly ahead, her mask finally, irrevocably shattered. As the judge read the sentences, long, substantial prison terms for both of them, he took off his glasses and looked directly at them, his voice filled with a cold, righteous anger. You did not just attack a member of your family, he said, his words a final, damning judgment. You desecrated the memory of a decorated veteran, you weaponized the honor of military service, and you defiled the very concept of what a home should be. You are a disgrace. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt release. A profound, bone-deep sense of release. The war was over. Justice, finally, had been done. Walking out of the courthouse, I was enveloped in a strange bubble of silence. The media scrum, the well-wishers, the distant clang of the courthouse doors, it all faded into a dull, muffled roar. The adrenaline that had sustained me for months finally drained away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The war was over, but the battlefield was still littered with wreckage. As Eli and I made our way towards the parking lot, we came face to face with them. My Aunt Carol, my cousins, a few other relatives who had been in the gallery. They had heard Serafina's poison, and for a time, they had believed it. They stood there now, their faces a mixture of shame, pity, and uncertainty. Aunt Carol opened her mouth to speak, her hand half raised in a hesitant gesture. I didn't say a word. I just stopped and looked at her, at all of them. My gaze wasn't angry or accusatory, it was just clear. In that single silent moment, they saw the truth they had refused to see before, and they saw the chasm that now lay between us. I gave a slight final nod and walked away. The old lines had been erased. New ones would have to be drawn. Stepping across the threshold of my own home later that day was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Eli had arranged for a professional cleaning crew to come through, so the forensic dust and police tape were gone. But the house felt haunted. I could still see the ghost of the attack in the living room, a psychic stain on the air. My eyes were drawn to the faint, circular indentation on the oak floor where the bronze statuette had fallen, a small scar on the heart of my home. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, just staring at that spot. Eli stood quietly behind me, giving me the space I needed. "It's not a crime scene anymore, Linda," he finally said, his voice gentle. "It's your home. You have to take it back, inch by inch." He was right, but it felt like an insurmountable task. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my own bed. I wrapped myself in one of my father's old quilts and slept on the sofa, a sentinel in my own haunted house. A few days later, a miracle happened. Or rather, the Ohio equivalent of one. A convoy of pickup trucks and minivans pulled up outside. Mrs. Rosie from the diner was at the head of the procession, her arms full of paint rollers. Mr. Miller was behind her, carrying 2 large cans of sky blue paint. A dozen other neighbors and townspeople followed, carrying paint trays, brushes, drop cloths, and flats of yellow rose bushes. They didn't make a big speech. They didn't ask a lot of questions. They just got to work. It was a silent, communal act of atonement and support. They were washing the walls and the town's conscience clean. They painted over the living room, covering the scene of the assault in a bright, cheerful blue that felt like a fresh start. Outside, a team of women dug up the trampled flower beds and planted the yellow roses, my father's favorite. It was their way of saying they were sorry for ever doubting me, their way of helping me reclaim my space. I stood on the porch and watched them, and for the first time since the trial, I cried. Not tears of rage or grief, but tears of overwhelming, cleansing gratitude for the decency of good people. About a month later, a letter arrived. The return address was a state penitentiary. It was from Damian. For a long moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. But I needed to know. I needed to close the final door. The letter was 10 pages long, a rambling, pathetic litany of self-pity and blame-shifting. Serafina had manipulated him. The financial pressure had made him, not himself. The market had turned against him. He never meant for things to go so far. He begged me to find it in my heart to forgive him, to write a letter to the parole board, to help him with his appeal. Not once did he take full, unequivocal responsibility. I read every last word, my heart growing colder. When I was done, I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held the corner of the first page to the flame. I watched the fire consume his excuses, his lies, his weak and hollow apologies, until all that was left was a pile of gray ash. Forgiveness might be possible someday, in some distant future where the scars had faded. But forgiveness and reconciliation were 2 very different things. My forgiveness would not include a key to my life. That boundary had been drawn in my own blood. The house was clean, but my mind was still cluttered. On the advice of a fellow veteran, I made a call to the local VA and started therapy. My therapist, a wise woman who had seen it all, gave me a book by Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor. I was struck by one of his quotes. "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." I couldn't change what Damian had done, but I could change what I did with the aftermath. I started spending my days in my father's workshop. At first, I just sat there, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust. Then, I started to clean, to organize his tools, feeling the worn wooden handles he had shaped with his own hands. And then slowly, I began to create. I took a rough block of basswood, and with one of my dad's carving knives, I started to whittle. My hands, a soldier's hands trained for combat, felt clumsy at first, but I persisted. I carved a small, simple bird. Then a fox. Then an intricate little box with a fitted lid. The focused, tactile work quieted the noise in my head. The process of taking something rough and shapeless and giving it form and beauty was a kind of therapy that no amount of talking could provide. The workshop, a place that had been just a memory of my father, was transforming. It was becoming a space of creation, of hope, of my own. I was rebuilding not just my home, but my soul, one wood shaving at a time. One afternoon, while clearing out an old locker, I found a small cedar box I'd never seen before. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were my father's military medals and a small stack of letters. One, written on old army stationery, was addressed to me. I unfolded it carefully. His familiar handwriting met my eyes. The letter was short, written just after I had graduated from West Point. The final line hit me with the force of a physical blow. My greatest legacy isn't what I leave behind, Linda, but who you become. My father's letter became my new compass. His words, "My greatest legacy isn't what I leave behind, Linda, but who you become," replayed in my mind, freeing me from the past. For years, I had defined my life by that house, first as a daughter within its walls, and then as its fierce protector. I had defended the fortress. I had reclaimed it. I had cleansed it of its ghosts. But sitting in the sunlit peace of my father's workshop a few years after the trial, surrounded by the smooth, finished wood of my own creations, I finally understood. The house was his legacy, but it wasn't meant to be mine. My role as its guardian was over. To truly become the person he hoped I would be, I needed to build a future of my own making, not just inhabit his. I decided to sell the house. When I told Eli, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the yellow roses that now bloomed riotously along the fence. I thought he would be disappointed, that he would see it as letting go of my father's memory. But then a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Arthur would have understood," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He built this house to be a place of happiness and safety for his family. He would have wanted his daughter to be happy, not to be a prisoner of the past, no matter how beautiful the prison. I didn't sell the house to the highest bidder. I didn't want it to go to some developer who would tear it down, or to a family who saw it only as a collection of bedrooms and bathrooms. I needed to know its spirit would live on. I chose the new owners carefully. They were a young military family, Sergeant Mike Evans, his wife Sarah, and their two small children, a boy and a girl. Mike had just returned from a rough deployment in the Middle East, and he carried the quiet weight of it in his shoulders. They were looking for a place to put down roots, a quiet harbor in a turbulent world. The day they came to see the house, I watched Sarah's eyes as she walked through the front door. I saw them light up with a hopeful warmth. "Oh, Mike," she whispered, her hand finding his. "This place, it feels like a real home." I knew then that I'd made the right choice. A week later, as I handed the old brass keys to Sergeant Evans, the very same keys my father had once given me, I felt a sense of peace, not loss. "This house protected my family for generations," I told them, my voice steady. "Now it's its turn to protect yours." With the proceeds from the sale, I didn't buy a bigger house or a fancier car. The desire for those things had been burned out of me. I used a portion of the money to buy a small, simple condo on the other side of town, a place that was just for me. And with the rest, the majority of it, I did something that I knew would have made my father burst with pride. I established the Arthur Morse Foundation. It was a small, local nonprofit with a simple mission. Using my father's old workshop as our headquarters, we started offering free woodworking and art therapy programs for veterans and their families. It became a place for them to come, to work with their hands in a quiet, focused way, and to connect with others who understood the silent language of trauma. It was a place to mend the invisible wounds of war, just as I had. The story ends here, but it also begins here. It ends on a Saturday morning, a few years later. The Ohio sun is streaming through the windows of the workshop, illuminating floating motes of sawdust like tiny golden stars. The air is filled with the scent of freshly cut cedar and the low hum of lathes and sanders. It's a sound of creation, not destruction. I'm standing beside Sergeant Mike Evans, who now comes every weekend. I'm showing him how to sand the curved wings of a small wooden airplane he's making for his son's birthday. And he is smiling. A genuine, unguarded smile that lights up his whole face. a smile that his wife, Sarah, later tells me, with tears in her eyes, she hadn't seen since before his last deployment. I look around the room. I see a former Marine, a woman who did 2 tours in Iraq, meticulously carving a delicate flower. I see an old Vietnam vet teaching a young soldier who lost his leg in a roadside bomb how to turn a bowl on the lathe. They are men and women who have walked through hell, who have faced the unimaginable. And now, they are finding their own peace in the rhythm of their work, in the steady companionship of their fellow soldiers. The warrior ethos, the creed that was drilled into me at West Point, has 4 tenets. The final one has always stayed with me. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I understand now that this oath doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Our comrades are all around us, fighting silent battles in the quiet of their own homes. I realize in this moment of profound and peaceful clarity that my father's true legacy wasn't the house on Washington Avenue. It wasn't in the wood and nails and brick. His legacy is right here. It's in this room. It's in these working hands, these slowly healing souls. It's in the smile on a soldier's face. I hadn't just survived for myself. I had survived to build this. And finally, in the truest sense of the word, I was home. And so, my story comes to a close. Thank you for walking this path with me. My fortress was once made of wood and nails, but I learned that the strongest walls are the ones we build inside ourselves. Walls of honor, resilience, and hope. Whatever battles you are facing, know that they do not have to be your entire story. It's what you build from the ashes that defines your true legacy. If stories of strength and survival resonate with you, I invite you to follow the channel and become part of our community. And if you know a fellow soldier who needs to hear that they are not alone, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening.